So if you find the screen too bright, you can look at it.
Yeah, thank you.
I just want to remind, we have a poster session. Did you mention that?
Not yet.
Not yet, right? So there's a poster session tonight. And there's blurbs that we do, 1 minute blurbs, for those who are in the session, in the third session. And after lunch or after the last lecture, you can go up and we'll be able to put up the posters. They're ready and push them till the 11th goes again.
All right. Hey, everyone. How's it going?
Good.
Okay. How's it going? Okay. You've just had one lecture of 90 minutes, and that's your second one in a row. You are so ready, right? It's 100% ready to go. Although the first one was really good again. So, oh, well. Oh, you got to give a bad one so that I look better in the second one. Okay. And then Julia's giving the first one tomorrow, so I'm in deep trouble. I'm always following good people. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, the first thing that I wanted to mention today, okay, so one thing I wanted to mention right away is I have a light blue background, so it should be a little bit less bright today, and hopefully it'll be okay. There are some other options. I hate the black background. I'm just going to say personal preference. I hate it. So let me know if it's still problematic, but this is darker, okay, today. So hopefully it'll be better. Okay, the second thing I need to say is that I also have a correction from yesterday's lecture, and a few of the students pointed it out to me. So you know who you are. Thanks for either sending me an email or coming to talk to me about it. And the correction is that when I gave you the big punchline of the rank nullity theorem, I did it wrong. Probably some of you noticed, right? I switched rank and dimension. So let me just write it out the correct way, because of course it's the rank of a matrix and its transpose that are the same. I always get it mixed up, so sorry. I got it mixed up in the lecture too. So the correction is that the rank of a matrix and its transpose are the same. Okay. So then when we write it out, the rank nullity theorem, the way you need to do it is rank of R plus nullity of R equals dim of R, which is what I did write correctly. And also the rank of R transpose plus the nullity of R transpose is equal to the dim of R transpose, right? But it's the ranks are the same, okay? And then the null of R is, these are exactly what I wrote out yesterday too. This is n times d, okay? The dimension of R, okay, is n times d. The dimension of R transpose is not equal to the dimension of R, it's equal to the m, right? The number of constraints, because they're rectangular matrices. Okay, the nullity of this thing is the number of states of self-stress, which I did write correctly yesterday. And then if we just set the ranks equal to each other, we recover that nd minus n0 equals m minus nss, which is the equation that I wrote down, which is correct. But the way I derived it was not right. So just a little correction there. Okay, cool? Okay. And then at the end of lecture last time, I wanted to pique your interest with an example. So if you remember, we had this 4-bar linkage, and we were computing how this Maxwell-Caledine constraint counting works for a 4-bar linkage. But the key and I think useful point about the 4-bar linkage is that there was nothing to say for the 4-bar linkage that it was a topological argument. It depended on the connectivity or the topology of this network. So there's nothing to say that I couldn't have envisioned a network that looked like this or a network that looked like this, right? The results didn't depend on the geometry of the network, in other words, right? So I'm just going to write that out. The results for Maxwell constraint counting, Maxwell-Caledine constraint counting, depend on the topology of the network, what is connected to what, not the geometry. Okay, and that's why when I gave you the following example 4, and so now we're continuing on from where we left off in the last lecture. I said, okay, if I have a situation where I extend the distance between points 1 and 4, so here I'm going to label the vertices in some way. It doesn't matter how I label them. But if I have a situation, and I'm going to draw this slightly out of plane so that you can see them, but they should be really close to horizontal, right? I have this 1 to 2 now, and I have a 2 to 3, and then a 3 to 4, and I've drawn them out of plane so that you can see them. But really, as I move the distance between 1 and 4 closer and closer to 3 times the rest length of one of the springs, this basically goes to something that looks nearly horizontal, right? Does everybody see? Okay, that's a change to the geometry, not a change to the topology, right? So if I do Maxwell-Callodine constraint counting on this, right, I find that I expect it's exactly as it was for this example. There's nothing different, and I find that this system should be floppy, right? That's what I get, okay? So hopefully that's all good. Okay, and so let me actually draw it now as really flat so that we can think about the mechanics of this situation. So again, if the system has rest length, so the rest length of the springs is L naught, then when the distance between 1 and 4 is approximately 3 times L naught, this is when this situation occurs, when I become basically flat. Okay, and so again, I'm going to draw 1, 2, 3, 4, but now at the point where I've really stretched it so that it's completely flat. And I still have these connections here between, 1 and 2 and 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. Okay. Yeah, and 1 and 4 is connected across. Yep, exactly. Okay, so and I'm just going to write it down, if the rest length that I set for between 1 and 4 is greater than 3 times L naught for the other springs, the system is flat. And you can see right away that none of the constraints, using our language from yesterday, remember we called them F alpha, so F12 is greater than 0 because it's not equal to its rest length. F23 is greater than 0, and F34 is greater than 0, okay? And that's because, for example, L12 is greater than L naught, okay? Cool, great, okay. There is tension in each of these bonds, right? There is tension or compression, right? There is a stress in each of these bonds. And that means that, and you can see it's a state that doesn't change the positions of any of the vertices, right? So that is what we mean by a state of self-stress. Remember, it's in the left null space of the rigidity matrix as we discussed yesterday. Okay, so that means there exists a state of self-stress in the system. And so when we do Maxwell-Callodine constraint counting, then it's even worse than before, because we get that n times d is equal to 8, right? We get that m is equal to 4, right? And now we have a state of self-stress here, okay, in the system. Okay, so that means that we have 5 floppy modes. Okay, and we already realized that there was 3 rigid body rotations, right, of this plaquette. And it still exists for this one, right? This one has the same possibilities for its motion, so those 3 rigid body rotations. Okay, and so what are those 2 non-trivial 0 modes? Okay, so this says there's 2 non-trivial, non-rigid body rotation linear 0 modes. But the object should be rigid because the constraints are not satisfied, right? There's a finite energy cost for any perturbation. So what the heck, okay, right? Okay, so the key idea, and this is the key idea for the rest of our probably discussion today, depending on how far I get. So the answer is yes. This analysis that we just did tells us only about perturbations to first order, is about perturbations to first order, consideration only to first order. Right? We had those partial f, partial x's, right? One derivative, one partial derivative. So what this means is, just to write it out in words, there exist 2 linear 0 modes that cost no energy to first order. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it clearly means we're physicists, right? It means they cost energy to second order, right? Okay, so let's see that. Okay, so what are the linear zero modes? If you solve this problem and you say what motions of these vertices cost zero energy to first order displacements, it's these two. So it's a motion of this vertex straight up and down and this vertex straight up and down, right? And if I think about what those perturbations cost, let's just draw the triangle, right? So I have a triangle, okay? And this is my point 1 and my point 2, which is one of the points in this in this linkage, right? And this is now L sub alpha, right? It's the distance that the springs actually are apart. And now I envision that I've perturbed the system straight up and down by a little perturbation, and I'll call it delta y, okay? And we know from the setup of this problem that this R12 is approximately L naught, and we're going to consider delta y's that are significantly less than the rest lengths between the springs. Okay, well then all of us know how to compute L sub alpha, right? And you're going to do it to perturbations. So take the next 3 minutes, work with your neighbor, get your brain active, compute this expression for L sub alpha in this geometry. Okay. It's a triangle, right? It looks like that L naught is squared. It's not squared. This is just labeling this vertex. All right. So hopefully, I just wanted to get you thinking about this, right? So hopefully you all wrote down, okay, this is just the square root of this squared, plus dy squared. And then you could factor out an R12, and then you could say this is the small thing because dy over R12 is our small parameter, basically. And then you take a Taylor expansion and you see that this is equal to basically 1 plus 1/2 times dy over R12 quantity squared, right? And this is basically, I can multiply it back through if I want, that I get a perturbation that looks like this, right? Good? Okay. And the key point is that, okay, if I was thinking about this constraint, what is df12 divide, partial with respect to this linear zero mode, right? Because we said this dy was our linear zero mode. What is this? Zero, right? There's no linear term, right? It's a triangle. This is the whole point, right? So this is equal to 0. Okay, so the point is, in words, the rigidity matrix doesn't know about this cost, right? It doesn't know about this cost. I like to anthropomorphize my matrices. Okay, so for this special geometry, okay, we need to consider second order perturbations to the constraints, right? Okay, and so now we need to do the following. So this tells us, okay, first order wasn't enough. What do? Well, the obvious thing is to write down the expression for the second order perturbation to the constraints. Do you remember we did this earlier for the first order perturbation of the constraints? So this is sum over I mu of df alpha over dxi mu. This is what we wrote down. This is the first order term. That's what we wrote down before. And now we're just going to write down the second order term, right? 1/2. Okay, now I have to sum over 2 indices, which is a little uglier, but no problem. We handle it, right? This is d squared f alpha over dxi mu d partial. Sorry, it's not a full derivative, obviously. And then times these variations in the configuration space, J nu. Okay, so we're going to put a box around this equation because this is an important equation. I'm going to give it a little symbol, a little star that I can come back to. Okay, and okay, so the idea is if the only dxi mu that, and this is a definition, that satisfy star are rigid body rotations, trivial modes, rigid body rotations, then the system is called second order rigid. And you might say, well, what about third order rigidity or fourth order rigidity? Actually, it's really cool. Bob Connolly has a series of papers showing that all higher order rigidities are completely messed up and don't tell you anything. Like you can get a third order rigid system that's actually floppy and all kinds of weird, crazy stuff. So second order rigidity seems to be the most you really need to do, practically speaking. Okay. And you can ask, when is second order rigidity sufficient to talk about structural rigidity? It's not always the case, but it very often is. And we'll talk about that. Yes. The only at DXI that satisfy, oh, yes, star equals 0. You're exactly right. Thank you. Thank you. Otherwise, it's a non-statement. It's not a theorem. Yeah, sorry, I meant that is equal, that variation is equal to 0. Okay? Okay. And so the question is actually, and this is the most mathy we're going to get. So how to figure out if this is true? Figure this out. Okay? And not all that easy. It's kind of complicated in general. So I'll say it's kind of complicated in general, but I'm going to sketch out a proof in general, but I'm going to sketch out an idea that works for a lot of systems. Something that works. that works for a whole bunch of example systems, including vertex models that we're going to talk about and fiber network models. So this thing I'm about to show you works for a lot of practical systems. Because this is kind of mathy, you might imagine, and it has to, you care about all kinds of weird edge cases, and there's a bunch of weird edge cases. Like you could make like crystalline lattices that do insane things, and you could really try hard to mess this up. Yes. Yes, there's lots of them. And I will try to get to that. And if I don't, come back to it, but that's a really great question. Yeah. Okay, so if you want to know like all of the details, there's a lot of details in an appendix to a paper we wrote a couple years ago. So it's gross. But if you want to read it, you can. And there's a lot of details there. Okay, here's the simple thing. So for a U, which is the total energy, that is quadratic in some constant. In some constraint. Constraint. So this is and again, you can generalize this, but I'm going to write it this way to simplify it. So we're going to assume that the energy can be written as quadratic for this, what I'm going to do next. Okay. Then we have that the variation in U looks like this, right? We have a first order term, which looks like this. It's F alpha df alpha over dxi mu times the variation I mu, okay? Then we have a second order term in the variation to the energy, right? And that's going to be a sum over now two configurations, the partial du dxi mu, dxi nu, and then dx, and then these variations. Okay. Does anything in this equation look familiar from an earlier lecture or something else we've seen either from Professor Das or from me? What is sticking out here in this equation? Does anybody feel brave enough to say it? I think some of you are looking at me like you know. The dynamical matrix, right? It's the dynamical matrix. From Ashcroft and Merman, they did it for a sort of system that was crystalline, right? But this object here is a much nastier object for a disordered system because we don't have the symmetries of the lattice. So we can't basically do that trick where we Fourier transform. So this matrix is n times d by n times d, right? Where n is the number of vertices in my system. So it grows in the thermodynamic limit. It's a gross thing now, okay? But it is the dynamical matrix. Still, our friend. Or maybe not our friend. I don't know if we like it or not. Do we like it? I don't know. Okay, so this is the dynamical matrix. Okay, so now I'm going to expand this term out in a way that makes it even more useful for doing other things later or noticing something about it. Okay, so specifically, this is plus, oh, I forgot a half. I should put a half in here, right? And then a little half in here. Okay, plus 1/2 times the sum over alpha of sum over I mu. So now I'm going to rewrite, because u is a function of the f's. So now I'm just going to expand out in partial derivatives. Yes. Yeah. I think, let me write out what this u is and you'll see it there. Let me write out the second order piece, because it includes the, let's see if I answer your question when I write this out, because I didn't write out that piece in terms of f's yet. The u in terms of f. So let's see if this, what I'm about to write, answers your question.
But I guess there would be a higher order term as well. No, there would be another quadratic term that is inside the u.
Yeah, so let me write it. Let me just write out the next step and we'll see if I have included the thing that you care about in there. Okay. So df dxi mu times dxi mu quantity squared plus the sum over, and this is all sums over alpha, I mu j nu f alpha d squared f alpha dxi mu dxj nu dxi mu dxj nu. So that's the way I would like to write this out. Okay? Does that solve your problem, Leo? That I put it in the U. Okay. So, and the reason I wanted to write it this way is because if you think about it, these terms are all of the second order contributions to changes in the energy, right? Okay, and so this thing is just the rigidity matrix, right? This little object in here is the rigidity matrix, R, right? But then I get this new term here, which is, and I'll call this object in here, well, I don't call it, lots of folks in the literature call it the pre-stress matrix. J nu, it has a disastrous number of indices. It's called the pre-stress matrix. Okay, and if I want to think then about how I can write D, okay, it's basically, I could write it as the sum over alpha of R transpose alpha R plus P alpha, where I'm thinking about taking the, contraction of all those in, I'm thinking about writing it in matrix notation, basically. Or sometimes people write it as R transpose R plus P if I do that, if I also include that summation over alpha, right? Okay, so this is the sort of key object then. Okay, and so then you notice that variations in U being 0, so a variation costing 0 energy to second order is if and only if basically I have that P dotted, this P matrix dotted with some variation to my coordinates is equal to R transpose R dotted with some variation to my coordinates, right? Okay, cool. Good. Okay, for some dx. Okay, good. And then we'll put a little box around this because this is pretty important. Okay. Okay, now it's going to get a little technical for a reason that might be helpful for folks who really get interested in this. Okay, but for many systems of interest, although not, I would say necessarily all, which includes some spring networks, actually spring networks in general, even those with the bending term, as long as they're under constrained, and some vertex models, although not all versions of vertex models, because there's a lot of versions of vertex models out there at this point. There are two conditions that happen when you hit the rigidity transition. There exists only one state of self-stress at the transition point. And it becomes important that there isn't a linear subspace of states of self-stress. Yes, question? If you want this square, is me having the two indices, like, right, I could write a square as having all four indices if I want. Yeah, it's, I wrote it compactly, but if you want, you could write it down in terms of all four indices if you so chose. Sorry, thank you. Okay, so there exists only one state of self-stress at the transition point, which I'll call sigma sub alpha. And for this, for this particular state of self-stress, the pre-stress matrix is positive definite on that state of self-stress. And I'll show you what I mean in math. Is positive definite, and actually it doesn't need to be positive definite, let me be precise, it's positive semi-definite. Sorry, I'm being a little mathy, but actually in this sort of thing, there's always a way out, and so technical details matter for the stuff, so sorry. I'll promise this is almost over. Okay, positive semi-definite. Okay, so what this means is that if I look at this expression for this particular state of self-stress, I'll put this in here. So this is now my, a particular sort of f sub a for this expression, dxj nu dxi mu dxi nu is greater than or equal to 0 is this specific condition. And of course, this is a sum over all these indices, j nu. Okay, so this is the condition of the pre-stress matrix being positive definite, positive semi-definite for some state of self-stress in the system. There exists a state of self-stress for which this expression is positive semi-definite. This is what's called in the engineering literature, and it's used almost exclusively in the engineering literature. It's called pre-stress stable. It's what almost everybody studies because this is a big class of systems, and it's very hard to get out of this. Like when you get out of this class, things get even more crazy, okay? But if these two things are true, then you can do a lot. So let me write down, this is called in case you ever get interested in this literature, this is called pre-stress stability in the engineering literature. And it's used a lot in the engineering literature. Okay, so if those two conditions are true, right, this was basically, if you think about it, this was the left-hand side of this expression up here, right? That was the left-hand side, so I'll write it left-hand side. This is the right-hand side, okay? But the right-hand side, which is R transpose R, is also positive semi-definite. Because you can write it out as it's a sum of terms, sum of quadratic terms, basically. In other words, it looks like a sum over alpha of something which is quadratic. It's a sum over df alpha by dxi mu, and all those terms inside the thing are real. So this object is also positive semi-definite, okay? So these two can only be equal when both sides are 0, okay? And that's why everyone studies pre-stress stability. So in this, if these two conditions are met, these two can only be equal when both sides are 0. So let's go look at that equation again and make sure we believe it, right? There's a negative sign in front of one, One is positive, the other's positive, positive semi-definite, right? So the two are equal only when they're both 0. Yes. I've replaced the F sub alpha, because a sigma is a type of F sub alpha. It's a type, it has the same units. It's a specific example of an F sub alpha. So I've replaced it with that specific one. Yes. Great. Okay. So everyone agrees. Okay. So these two can only be equal when both sides are 0. Okay, but the right-hand side, okay, is only 0 for what? A linear 0 mode. That's, because it's just the rigidity, right? It's something that's, I'm dot producting with a displacement and getting 0. That is the definition of a linear 0 mode, because that's just the rigidity matrix. So the right-hand side is only 0 for a linear 0 mode. Okay, so we're left with this is the sort of key result that we've used in a lot of cases, and that I think lots of folks have used this and called it different things in other fields too. Where basically then du equals 0, if I and those two clauses I said are satisfied, right? It's only in these cases. Then this is equivalent to this expression. I just look at all of my linear 0 modes and I ask if this object, which is the pre-stress matrix, basically, operating on a variation of the coordinates, dx, j, nu, is equal to 0 for dx being a linear 0 mode. Okay. This is the big result I wanted to have, because now we can use it to think about a whole bunch of different things that are useful for biology. I see a couple questions. Yes? Yes. Yes. Oh, that's a really good question. Sorry. Thank you for asking that. I meant to actually ask that as a question. This is 0. This linear term is 0. Why? So think about it for a second. It's the same reason that we didn't have a linear term in the expansion for the dynamical matrix in a crystal. This is basically, if you think about it, this first term is basically forces that would generate you moving downhill. And we're assuming that we're in a mechanically stable state to start with, right? We're asking about stability, right? And so there's no forces in this situation. That's a really good question. So this object, thank you so much. This sucker is 0 for exactly the same reason it is in Ashcroft and Merman. Great question. Did you have the same question or a different one? Okay. It's not a guarantee, right? So if you're ever interested in that, you should sort of see, but it turns out that a lot of systems are pre-stress stable. Positive semi-definite all the time, or do you also need that? No, it's positive semi-definite all the time because you can write it as a sum of quadratic terms, right? So it has to be positive semi-definite. Yes. Oh, that is, I didn't say why. And the answer is I don't know. So I said, if you look at a system and it only has one state of self-stress at the rigidity transition, then this follows. But I didn't say why, or if we had a proof that such a thing exists or anything like that. And the reason why you need that, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, but the reason why you need that is because if there was a subspace of sigma alphas, that multiple sigma alphas that all kind of gave you a self-stress right at the critical point, then there's a subspace of them, and you have to consider linear combinations of them, which I didn't want to do for this derivation, and actually it's quite hard in general. You could imagine a situation, what I will tell you is all of the things that biology, that like all of the toy models that we've looked at in biology do have this feature that you only get one state of self-stress when you cross across the rigidity transition. And we have some thoughts as to why, but we don't have a formal proof. Okay, it's a little bit of an open question in case anybody's interested. Yeah. So actually, can I save that for the break? It is a long conversation. I have to introduce a lot more. I have to introduce kind of a lot more ideas. And actually, I might be able to answer that question depending on how far we get in the lecture on Wednesday, because there's some understanding of the geometry of the critical manifold that we've been working on. Like it has a beautiful geometry, and we think that that feature has to do with features of the critical manifold for certain systems. Okay. Yeah. So I think I've just proven that it's not possible for this case because R dagger R is positive semi-definite, right? So what I've shown you here is basically, it's just saying if I have two equations and one's the minus of the other and both are positive semi-definite, then there doesn't exist such a thing. I don't know, I don't have a better intuitive explanation, but the math says so. Okay, cool. Carlos.
What are examples of multiple states, even outside of?
Oh, in over-constrained jammed packings or spring networks. Okay, so it's really easy, and in fact, you get them because if you have redundant constraints, you get a Maxwell-Caledine constraint counting tells you that you get an extra state of self-stress for every constraint, right? So like jammed packings, you keep over compressing them and you just get more and more states of self-stress. So like those of you, I don't know if any of you are like granular people, but like Bob Behringer's work and you see all those force chains, like maybe you know that there's different patterns of force chains that you can put on the same geometry. Those are, you can think of them roughly as the possible states of self-stress for a given over-constrained network. Right at the jamming transition, you don't have any extra. There's only one state of self-stress that you can have exactly at the jamming transition. Cool, right? Yeah.
Could be dumbest point ever, but this thing that you're calling D, I mean, if it were anti-symmetric somehow, then this second order contribution would vanish for all.
He was anti.
All
and sorry, say that one more time. I didn't catch the point.
Sorry, if D were anti-symmetric.
So the dynamical matrix, if it were anti-symmetric, is it possible for that to happen? Yeah, I don't generally consider that case when I'm thinking about physical problems. I don't think I've seen an example that isn't maybe dissipative or active.
Yeah, it would have to be
dissipative and active, probably. Probably both. Okay. Yeah, exactly. Then there's a whole, okay, so maybe one thing I could say is actually there's a really, I think, interesting set of questions about how what I'm saying generalizes to both finite fluctuations, non-reciprocal systems, and active systems, which I am totally, I don't fully understand, but I think is a set of interesting open problems. And also, like, Vincenzo Vitelli, is Vincenzo talking next week? And I've had some ongoing conversations about how this might work. So it's not out of the realm. I just haven't thought about it too much. So yeah. Okay, should we keep going? Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so this is the thing. And you can, of course, write this also if you want, this condition in compact form. It's that there's some perturbation that if you make this form with the pre-stress matrix, it equals 0. Okay, so it's a condition on a linear zero mode so that it is also floppy to second order, right? This is the condition for having floppiness to second order in a system. Okay, so let's go back to our example and check how it works. It should work now, right? We should be able to tell that this thing is rigid with our new technology. Okay, so here's the picture again, 1 and 4, and then we have, 2 and 3 in a straight line here, and we have these extra bonds here, 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 right? And here is our linear zero modes. We already know what those are, right? Okay, so now let's do it. Okay, there exists a state of self-stress. We know that, we already discussed that, of self-stress. And it does turn out that for this system and a lot of systems, there's only one at the transition, because you can write down what it is. Our linear zero mode is this dy, this object, okay? So then we can look at d squared f alpha by d, this perturbation squared, okay? That's d squared L alpha by d dy squared. And you all just worked out that L sub alpha, right, was R12 plus 1/2 delta y quantity squared over R12, right? You all did that. Good job. Okay. And then we can take its derivatives, right? So the first derivative, right, is going to be linear in dy. Okay. So the second derivative is a number, right? Okay. Partial dy, partial to a constant. Okay. So this is some number, which is not equal to 0. Good. Okay. So this is not floppy to second order. Not floppy to second order. That's good. And we can say it's second order rigid. Okay. And the system is rigid. Is rigid. Good. Okay. And you might say, well, this is a very special example, Lisa, right? You might say, Professor Manning, this is a stupid example. Like clearly it's a straight line, it's one-dimensional, it's super dumb, right? You're right, okay? So you might think this particular geometry won't happen generically, right? The straight line, it might be a special feature of doing it in one dimension, right? This particular geometry won't happen generically, question mark? Won't happen generically. Will it? I don't know. Okay. So the way that I like to think about this, and it might be, I hope to get back to this during the lecture tomorrow, but it turns out that the rigid states are a finite region of the space. That you can think of the space of rigid states. It's not a set of measure 0. It's a finite region of the phase space. And the way that I'm going to show this to you tomorrow, so I'm going to show it to you today too, is that I'm going to replace the 4-bar linkage by a slightly easier to draw the phase space of it 3-bar linkage. So here's still my point 1, my vertex 1, 2, 3, and 4. Right. So, but instead of having a bar between 1 and 4, now I'm just going to fix the position. So these little triangles in the engineering literature mean I fix those positions and allow it to rotate. Okay. And I'm going to say what happens is I change the distance between these 2 points, right? So this is now called a 3-bar linkage instead of a 4-bar linkage. And the reason I want to do this is because I can draw stuff in 3 dimensions, kind of, right? So there's a 3-dimensional space for the lengths of these bonds. So let me call this length 1, length 2, length 3, right? Okay, and so then I can draw a phase space of what does it look like in the possible, if I fix the distance between 1 and 4 to be some length, what does it look like if I do sort of, this is the L1, L2, and L3. And what you find is, and I'll show you a picture a nicer picture of this in a minute, there's actually a critical manifold in this space where the thing just becomes rigid. And I'm sort of trying, it's like a little, I don't know, kite-shaped thing in this space. Okay. And if I'm sort of sitting there behind it, so if I'm in the basically bottom corner, if all of the lengths are small in this diagram, does everybody see what I'm doing? I'm like zooming in behind this flag in this setup. If I'm underneath that, kite or flag, all the points below that are rigid, right? It's a finite region of space. All points below are rigid, or second order rigid. And above that region, if I'm out sort of at larger lengths, they're all, the system is floppy. Okay, great. Yes. That's a great question. I'm referring to them as the actual lengths. They're the bond vectors themselves, not the rest lengths of the springs. Yeah, that's a really good question. So in this setup, I'm assuming that all of the rest lengths, there's some L naught. And I'll show you in a second when I get some slides up here. Yeah, I should have time to get to some slides. That you can either think about sort of changing the distance. So I could basically sort of think about fixing the distance between points 1 and 4, and then changing the rest lengths if I wanted to go across this rigidity transition. Or I could think about, fixing the rest lengths as that being an inherent property of those springs, and then straining my box, changing the distance between 1 and 4. And what it will do is that you can think of that as a parameter space. It's basically sort of changing where this kite lives in this space. Okay, and I'll show you, I think I might have an animation of it in a slide for the 3-bar linkage later. Yeah, exactly. There's some length scale here that you could divide by, exactly. Yeah, that's a characteristic scale in the problem. Thanks, that's a really good question. Yes. It turns out that they are. I will show you in a little bit an animation of this space, because the critical, I'm showing you just a little flag of points that are sort of rigid, but actually this also does also finds critical points that are branch points that are sort of snap through instabilities of this linkage too. And they're out there. So there are unstable ones. I'm just showing you the subset of this space that is stable. It's basically just, I've stretched out, it's like a guitar string. It's all of the, so you can either think, okay, because it's what I just said here. You can, let's do the thing where I sort of say, okay, I can either fix the distance between these 2 points, and basically, I can sort of say, okay, if my lengths are less than the rest length, basically that you hit for a given choice of rest length, where you hit this orange flag is where you basically get the lengths of the individual springs to be greater than their rest lengths. Okay, that's where you hit it. And so basically, you can also think about it if I have a guitar string, which, you can think about as a bunch of little springs, because, the string is like a bunch of little, it's a fiber, right? Okay. When you tune a guitar string, it's floppy up until you get it to the critical point where you basically stretch the guitar string to exactly it's where all of the little springs are at their rest lengths. And then as I stretch it further, I actually increase the shear modulus, and then the pitch increases. And that's how a guitar string works. Guitar strings are second order rigid. Okay? Okay, cool. Yeah. Exactly. Yep. That's exactly right. Awesome. Okay, cool. So this is not a special feature of this example. And so just to write it out in words, it's very generic. And I'm about to show you how generic it is. Very generic. A change, and the key point is a change in the geometry of a network can allow an under-constrained network to become second order rigid. And in fact, tomorrow I might tell you about how it's actually really is a smooth manifold with a nice geometry. And it's actually, for even really complex disordered networks, the equivalent of this flag is always codimension unity in the space, which means that you always cross it. That means that, like, however big my configuration space is, this is a manifold that's basically a sheet in that high dimensional space. It's codimension 1, right? So almost any dynamics can take me through it. That's cool. Okay. And in fact, that's what happens. And now we finally get to the biology component of this. I wanted to show you all the math first, and now we're going to talk about how I think a lot of biological systems use this feature all the time. Okay, so what are some examples that are not just like little bars? Okay, examples in biology. Okay, and I'm trying to decide. Okay, I think I'm going to be brave and try to switch back and forth a couple of times between my slides and writing on the board. So if this fails miserably, I apologize in advance. Are you all ready for this? Hopefully it'll just work. Okay, let's see if I can make it work. I'm going to try to do this once or twice where I'll switch back and forth because I want to give you an example and then I want to go through the math. Okay, cool. So this is a picture of the flag, that orange flag I was showing you. The axes here are the lengths of the 3-bar linkage. And this is some work by Tyler Hain and in collaboration with Chris Santangelo. And actually, Chris has shown this manifold in a few other papers too. Okay, so if I'm in this corner, the system is rigid, right? This is the critical manifold. These are actually also critically rigid, but there's some bars that are under tension and some that are under compression in these purple regions. And then all this gray stuff, it's cool. Those are branch points, which are also interesting, right? Like snap through instabilities that you might think of using for materials design if you wanted to too. And we understand those too. Well, actually that's strong. I don't know if we understand them fully. Okay, so these are a good model, it turns out, for many fiber networks in biology. So I'm showing you some images of these top two are reconstituted collagen networks by, actually this was a cool paper with a big collaboration, like Waits is on this paper and Fred McIntosh is on this paper and other people. This is just showing you that you can get a change in basically both the branching of the network and also its basically sort of density as a function of what temperature that you reconstitute it in, right? And so you can study how the properties, the mechanical properties of these networks change as a function of temperature. And this is actually an image from bovine knee cartilage. So like, your knee cartilage, especially if you're old and a runner, gets real bad, and part of it is both a degradation of the network. And actually you can see that depending on whether you're closer to the surface of where the knees touch or deeper, like you get some alignment effects too, which I might talk about a little bit, okay? But the key point is that if you're trying to make a mathematical model for these systems, what folks do, and you saw this from Momita Das, Professor Das already, is it's a spring network plus some bending terms. Okay, and so I think you've already seen that a lot, so I'm not going to belabor the point, but this energy functional is exactly the one that I showed you as the example in our notes, right? It's just like Hookean springs and they're connected to one another. And it turns out that in biological tissue networks like collagen, they're almost always under constraint. So that means that Z is less than ZC, which is 2 times D, which is 6, right? The branching at each point is less than 6, it turns out. Okay. And so that gives rise to a picture like this. So this is I love this. I show it all the time from a paper that appeared in Nature Physics in 2006. So this is the number of branches. And this is a picture of like a reconstituted collagen network. And so this one has like an example of a 4-fold branch point at a vertex. And here's a 3-branch at a vertex. And this is typically what you see. And if you try to go in and extract what the Z is, it's usually somewhere between 3 and 4 in 3D. So very under constrained, right? Should be floppy. Okay, bending moduli actually stabilize this a little bit. And there's a beautiful crossover, which you studied, I think, the EMT for, right? The effective medium theory for. So there's a subtlety here. But in general, the strong modulus that you actually need for collagen to perform its function only really occurs in this rigid phase, and it doesn't depend on the bending, okay? So if you're below this number, this axis is the strain. This is changing the box size. This is changing the distance between 1 and 4 in my network, right? I'm changing the box size. And when I change the box size, there's a critical box size at which the system becomes rigid. And this is second order rigidity. Cool? So you can kind of go in 2 ways. You can increase the connectivity. You can increase the strain, and this gives you an amazing control over the rheological properties of a system. And you can also think, oh, isn't it cool that cells pulling on these things could actually take them locally over the rigidity transition by straining locally in certain places, right? But this is the physics. Okay, cool. Okay, so this is my picture in case what I've said a couple of times is a little bit confusing to you. I just want to make sure we're on the same page that if I start with a spring like this and I have a rest length, right, a given rest length, that either I can strain the box at fixed rest length, or the math is exactly the same if I shrink the rest length and keep the box size fixed. That's just a gauge variable. They're exactly the same for the mathematics, okay? Cool. Okay. And here's some real data now, because that one was just a diagram. Okay, here is basically the behavior of a system, and here's the shear modulus, and this is a logarithmic plot. Okay, so you can see there's a characteristic strain approximately here, at which these systems become orders of magnitude more rigid. So this is called strain stiffening in the literature on extracellular matrix networks, and it really is a second order rigidity transition. And so that generates some interesting features of it. Okay. Okay, so that's one example. Do I want to go through and show you the map? I think I don't want to do too many switches. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to talk a little bit about, yeah, I'm going to switch back to yes. Sorry, I skipped over that really fast. Momita Das covered this in her lectures. This basically modulus is totally generated by the bending energy of the fibers. And so it turns out that in most fiber networks, that's orders of magnitude lower than the spring stiffness if you pull. And so that's why this is entirely, like this plateau is actually directly proportional to the bending modulus, okay, here. And so it's actually a crossover. It's not a perfect rigidity transition. And there's some really beautiful crossover scaling of this. And Fred McIntosh and others have really done a good job of analyzing all of that. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Then if there's this stability, wouldn't the gap maybe?
Okay, so there's an awesome paper by Itai Cohen and Momita Das that says exactly this. Okay, you can even, and they've written out a beautiful model and they've done shear, so cartilage. So they took chunks of cartilage where basically, so maybe I'll say a word to the whole group. Cartilage is not just the collagen. There's basically all of these very soft gels, hydrogels, that also sit interspersed, and this is what you're talking about. Yes, that sit interspersed inside the cartilage in your knees, and it's very important to its function. And I would say functionally, it's a little unclear what role it's been playing in the system mechanically. And basically what Momita and Itai Professor Das and Professor Cohen did is they demonstrated basically that there was a lovely way to incorporate the role of basically the soft gel, because it's not really very stretchy, but it does prevent dilation of the network, and it also prevents rotations of the network. And so you can just add two basically effective terms that basically increase Z. They increase the effective connectivity of the network. And then you, on this phase diagram, I don't know. But on this phase diagram, it basically takes you along this axis a little bit further so that you strain, stiffen less. It's really cool. Yeah. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to switch back. Switching. Okay, let's hope this works, everyone. Did it work? Yes. Okay, now I need to get my notes. Okay, so let's talk very briefly about under-constrained spring networks and the physics of them. So where's my pen? Okay, so Z is less than ZC, okay, in both 2D and 3D. It's a model for collagen networks. The typical branching is between 3 and 4, okay? We just saw that the F sub alpha is basically, I'm going to write it this way because I don't want to have a separate, I'm going to incorporate the K's inside the constraints just to make the math a little bit easier. Just as before in our formulations, okay? And the U is equal to 1/2 the sum over, so actually, I never wrote in these notes. These are under constrained spring networks. Spring networks like collagen. Okay. And there's the sum over alpha, F sub alpha quantity squared. Okay. And we find generically that, so basically what we just showed, all of that math showed, is that there should exist a critical L naught star at which if we assume, just as you said, that let's take a simplified model where all the rest lengths are the same for all of the springs. That kind of isn't too unreasonable. You can also add fluctuations, but it's a little bit more complicated. And then we sort of say, okay, there's a critical L naught star at which the system becomes rigid. So for L naught less than L naught star, so if we fix the boundaries, okay, there exists a critical L naught at which, for L naught less than L naught star, the system becomes rigid. Right, so we have something that looks like this. Oh, and I should just write out, okay, just to show that it's under constrained, the number of degrees of freedom in these systems is the number of vertices times d. The number of constraints is z over 2 times n vertices, which is exactly what Professor Das already wrote down. So we have that, you know, in should we do it in 2D or 3D? Let's just do it in 2D. So let's say, for example, for a simulation of a network like this, let's say z is 3 and we're in 2 dimensions, then we have that 3 halves NV is less than 2 times NV, and the system is under constrained. Okay, just to sort of get us settled. And we find in general that there's a critical L naught below which the system becomes rigid, or equivalently. So let's say biologically, what is this saying? This is saying if I had an active process or a tunable or adaptive process by which I could change the effective rest length of pieces between my collagen network, I could drive the system to a rigidity transition, right? So for example, if I have a contractile cell that's living on a few branches of this network, and there's actually some beautiful work by like Martin Lenz and Chase Brodush and others that sort of show that when you do this, you locally rigidify the system for exactly this reason. Okay, that's neat. Okay, but you could also, instead of fixing the boundaries, you could say, oh, I don't want to fix the boundaries. Let's fix L naught. And there exists a critical size of the box. Or strain. This was defined very nicely by Ulrich earlier, at which the system becomes rigid. Right? And that might be relevant, for example, for your knee cartilage, right? Like you sort of say, how long can I strain this before I really want it to stiffen up and not let the joint move anymore, right? It's a very useful feature. Okay. And if I drew a picture of this, like one thing I might try to do is I might try to plot the shear modulus as a function of L naught, let's say, for this example, right? So the first thing I want to say is one of the concrete problems I gave was to compute the shear modulus for systems from the dynamical matrix, right? And I wanted you to do that because you can show basically that you can write the zero frequency shear modulus, which is basically like, what is the resistance if I shear my box, right? So shearing a box is something like I have a box and then I shear it. And the amount that I shear it by in the dimensionless form that Ulrich introduced is like Lx over Ly is gamma. So it's parameterized by a shear strain gamma. Okay. And then you sort of say, oh, the shear modulus is defined as the total derivative. And I think you need a factor of volume here of the energy to get the units to work out divided by d gamma squared, right? That's the definition of shear modulus. And the homework or concrete problem is to show that actually you can write this expression in terms of our old friend, the dynamical matrix, right? And actually weighted sum over normal modes of the dynamical matrix, which is really nice. So once you've understood that the system is second order rigid, that is a feature of the dynamical matrix, right? That's what we just showed. Then it also turns out that as long as none of your zero modes overlap with a shear degree of freedom, you have a finite shear modulus. And so that's the subtlety I wanted you to know, is that, okay, in general, rigid says that I have no zero modes, no non-trivial zero modes, right? And if I want to know if I can do this at zero energy, it matters whether those zero modes overlap with this shear degree of freedom or not. So that's what the homework exercise is about, making sure you kind of get that little subtlety. Okay, but in general, the dynamical matrix and the shear modulus tell you the same set of things. And so there's this L naught star. And if my actual rest lengths for fixed boundary conditions are less than this L naught star, I have a finite shear modulus. And it actually turns out that in a lot of systems, there's actually a finite jump if I have a finite size system. And that if I actually go to the thermodynamic limit in the shear modulus, I no longer have a finite jump. So that's kind of a cute feature. In the thermodynamic limit, it always looks like that. And this is the shape of the curve for systems in general that are second order rigid. Turns out it's linear. Okay, so that's one example. The next example I wanted to go through, which is the one I've been waiting for a long time, is vertex models, because I really work on them and I really like them. Okay, but I wanted to show you all the math and that this was very general before showing you how it works in vertex models. Actually, sadly, there's one other thing I want to do before I get to vertex models, which is I want to give you a little flavor of how you think about encoding the geometry of a network if you're going to do sort of like computations on these types of systems. So I just want to give you a little flavor of what that looks like. So in general, the bonds in one of these networks can be written as what's called an incidence matrix times the configurational degrees of freedom plus some effects of the boundary conditions. And I just want you to have seen this. So this thing is an object that encodes the boundary conditions, like periodic or fixed. It can do either one. And if folks want to know more, I think that's a technical offline conversation to show you how it works. This is the coordinates of vertex I. This is what's called the incidence matrix, and I'll write down what that is in a second. And this is used in a lot of like work on networks, actually, so I thought it might be nice for you to see it here. Okay, and this is the vector along the bond or along a constraint, right? So this is the same notation as before, except now I've sort of written it out, and there's this incidence matrix that you basically see it connects the coordinates to the bonds, okay? That's all it does. And so of course, it's basically just encoding the geometry of the edges, right? So specifically, GI alpha is 1 if vertex I is at the head of edge alpha. And so we actually have edges that have signs. They have a head and a tail in order to write this down. But it turns out that all the physics is invariant to the choice. So it's easier to write this down if you assume each edge has a head and a tail. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which choice you made for that. Okay, and then this is -1 if vertex I is at the tail. Okay, and 0 otherwise. So it's just a bunch of ones and zeros that encode basically the behavior of how the coordinates are connected to the vectors or the edges. Okay, and so then U basically, right, is equal to the sum of these objects. So these K alpha is L alpha minus L alpha naught. And this is squared. Okay, and the reason I wanted to write this out one more time is because I want to set you up maybe for the talks by Andrea next week, Andrea Liu. Because of course, this thing really, because it depends on the xi's, this is what I would call, loosely, it's a configurational variable because there's a linear sort of basically equation that relates these x's, which are the vertices, to these l's, right? So they're sort of still configurational variables. They depend on the xi's, right? Obviously, and the edges. So once you sort of write those down, you have the l's. Okay. Then I want to point out that these things are really interesting because in condensed matter physics, you never get to play with them. But in biology, in general, so in condensed matter physics, this would be a model parameter, like the stiffness of the bond between this atom and that atom, right? Is that a good condensed matter voice? Yes? Okay. Okay. They're chosen, okay, but now in biology, or even in a computer, they could be chosen by the modeler, right? They could be chosen, or they could be chosen by the organism via evolution or development or something. They could be encoded in the DNA that certain bits of these have certain things and other bits of these have other parameters, right? So these are in some cases called they could be an adaptive degree of freedom in biology, right? So I think next week, Andrea Liu, hopefully, will discuss these as adaptive degrees of freedom. Adaptive degrees of freedom. And this is sort of in mechanical networks, I think you can think about these objects as mechanical adaptive degrees of freedom that you can tune in order to execute a task. In other words, that could allow biology to learn to execute a specific task. So these are adaptive degrees of freedom that biology, I propose, could use to, and we're thinking about it actively in research, could use to learn to execute a task. Okay. So I just wanted you to see that. Okay, now vertex models. Woo. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can explicitly write the rigidity matrix in terms of G. Exactly. Yes, exactly. Okay. Okay. That's a really good question. Thanks. Okay, vertex models. We have 15 minutes? Yeah, ish. Okay. Vertex models. Okay, so what is a vertex model? No one's talked about this yet, right? No? Okay. Yes? No? No? Okay, good. All right, so here is a cartoon of a couple of epithelial cells that are in a monolayer. It's a terrible drawing, but forgive me. I just want to give you a cartoon of some things. Okay, so there's a basal side to these cells, which is often attached to a basement membrane, or if you're doing cell culture, that sits on a glass plate. And then there's an apical side up here. The behavior on the basal side of the cells is actually quite different from the apical side. And often when you look at images in the literature, people show you the apical side because it's easy to see. Vertex models often focus on the behavior of the apical side. So if I sort of took a top-down view, for example, of these cells on the apical side, I would basically get something that looks like kind of like a pattern of polygons, that looks something like this, right? That are connected by that. It is called it's really an unfortunate naming at this point that like there's lots of other there's like vertex models and statistical mechanics and other things, but here we're referring to the vertices and the edges that connect the edges of the cells. That's what this is talking about. Okay, and so there is a lot of beautiful work in biology that focuses sort of, some biologists spend their entire lives thinking about like these adherens junctions, for example, that are a zone. So these are called the lateral interfaces of the cells. And they're sort of ignored in two-dimensional vertex models largely, although they're very interesting too. And a little bit down from the top, there's this zone that has the cross-linking between the actin and myosin cytoskeleton. And this is sort of the adherens junctions and that are sort of linked to the actin cytoskeleton. Okay, and I wanted to highlight a couple of the papers on this because, and I think there's a place on the Google Drive to drop references, right? So I'll try to gather all of the references that I've given in my talks to make sure they're all in one place with links. Okay, but the very first, it's just a gorgeous set of papers. So Nagai and Honda were the first to write this down in 2001. Okay, in a Philosophy Magazine B article that's really cool. I highly recommend it. Okay, what? They have a 2004 paper, which is 3D, but they actually have an earlier paper, which is 2D. Yeah, it's kind of hard to find, but it's really neat. And so I'm pretty sure that I have this right. And then the sort of I think probably it was popularized by Farhadi Far in a great paper from a collaboration from Frank Ulicker and Suzanne Eaton that appeared in Current Biology in 2007. And actually simultaneously, there was a cool paper, Huffnagel with Boris Schreiman and others that appeared in PNAS in 2007. So these, I think, are some of the seminal papers for vertex models. And it's sort of the key pieces of it is that at least initially, this was all a monolayer of cells. And the apical side looks like a network of polygons. Okay. And so then the degrees of freedom are just these vertices. Xi mu looks familiar, right? So they're composed of the positions of the vertices and also an incidence matrix, right? That tells you where the edges are, right? Which edges connect which vertices. So to start simulating a vertex model, you need, again, these Xi mu's, and you need a G alpha I that tells you how they're connected. And that's the description of both the geometry and the topology of that network. Okay. And the key thing is that the idea about why I think fundamentally it works, even though it's completely insane. So I think the very brave and insane thing that people did is they said this geometry gives rise to forces which depend on, so this geometry and topology gives rise to forces. And we're going to assume that those forces, depend on the cross-sectional area of the cells A and the perimeter P. Like, that's insane. Okay. So one quick point is that in isotropic tissues, meaning that there's no shear forces or something like planar cell polarity that sets up a field of anisotropic myosin, you can show pretty quickly that the vertices, you should expect the vertices to be threefold coordinated in general, are usually threefold coordinated. Okay, why is that? That's easy. Because if you assume, and I think it's a very general assumption, assume that each edge has some sort of tension on it, and that the tension is positive, has some sort of tension. And I think maybe we heard a little bit today, you'll hear more like actin and myosin are an active gel that basically act on long time scales like a fluid. And so they generate a mechanical property that's like a surface tension. Okay, so we have this ring of actin and myosin that's sort of associated with the adherence junctions here that is dense actin and myosin working together, and the little motors are crawling around and doing all that cool stuff, and they're basically generating a gel. And you can do micropipette aspiration experiments that are really beautiful that show that the rheology basically on long enough timescales of that actin cortex is basically like a surface tension, not an elasticity, okay? So if that's true, then if we have some sort of surface tension-like term, then the energy of the system is going to be sum over some edges of the tension times the length of each edge, right? Now we try to minimize this. And you can do the following, Gedanken experiment where you can say, let's say I have 4 points on my apical surface, which are vertices of my cell, and I could choose to connect them up in one of 2 ways. I could either choose to connect them up with a 4-fold vertex in the middle, 4-fold vertex, or I could choose to connect them up with a 3-fold vertex. This is a very cute little differential problem to say, okay, clearly, if I want to minimize U, so the game is, let's minimize the total energy. Okay, so you want to minimize U. Well, if this is the effective energy, and this is a very generic energy functional, like the vertex model does give rise to an effective surface tension as well, which is some more complicated function, but just now we're just saying there's any finite tension at all on those interfaces. Minimizing U means minimizing L. Okay, minimizing U is minimizing L, right? The L sub alpha, the sum over alpha of L sub alpha, actually. And you can show, if you compare these two, right, that the threefold coordinated vertex always wins, right? The lowest length is the threefold coordinated vertex, okay? So maybe that's an exercise. The threefold always wins. It's actually like, this is a cute problem maybe if some of you are a TA in a course for like undergraduate students. It's actually really easy to do in Qt. Okay, the threefold always wins. Okay, but knows actually, because of course, there's some beautiful papers by like Max B and a few others showing that there's structures like rosettes that often show up in developmental biology and in some other systems. And then you can have really high fold coordinated vertices, and you see these, they show up. Okay, so you can say, well, why do those show up? If I make one of these tensions really big, right? If I don't have a uniform sigma and I can't pull the sigma out, then you can get a different answer to this problem. Because actually, in functionally what happens is you start out with something that looks threefold coordinated, and if I put a lot of extra tension on this one, then the minimum energy is going to shrink that interface and turn it into a fourfold coordinated vertex. So this thing of threefold coordinated vertices assumes basically there aren't any weird correlations or otherwise anisotropies in the tension in these tissues. But as soon as you get anisotropies, this breaks down and you can get all sorts of rosette-like structures. Cool? Okay, but for our purposes, let's consider isotropic tissues where we have threefold coordinated vertices. Okay, we're going to be in that regime, at least initially, and then we can explore what happens when that breaks. Okay, so to proceed, what are we going to do next? We need to describe how a mechanical energy U, if we're going to do rigidity, right? We need to describe how a mechanical energy U arises from vertices and configurations, right? We need to write U as a function of the xi mu and g alpha I. And what Honda and Nagai and then others told us to do is the following, and then I'll describe it. They said this. They said, here is something that we should write down. And this is the fun and awesome and crazy part. And maybe if I could just say a little bit of a word about this, I think this is what we as physicists who work on biological problems should be brave enough to do. I think sometimes writing something down that seems too simple to be true, and then seeing how far you can get with it, because with biology, we are always coarse graining, always. If you're trying to do anything above the scale of like a protein, right? Even with proteins, quite frankly, if you want to do more than nanoseconds, right? And so I think this is really nice because it's an attempt to kind of make a bold claim about what an energy functional might be that you could learn something from, even though you know it kind of has to be wrong at some deep level because it doesn't include dissipative or non-reciprocal effects. It doesn't include details about any of the biology that you think should maybe be important, right? It's an attempt to understand an emergent behavior from a coarse-grained model. And I think, feel free to do it. I think it's fun. Okay, and these people got cited a lot, so look at them. Okay, yeah. I'm going to show you how it is. Great. It doesn't look quadratic enough, but secretly it is. Yeah, exactly. You're ahead of the game. Okay. No, it's fine. But let me tell you where this comes from, because this comes from trying to think about the biology a little bit. So I'll spend the next 5 minutes talking about that, and then I'll start from, what you actually do with this tomorrow. So let's talk about the biology or where this comes from. Okay. So the idea is, for this term first, let's talk about where does this term come from. So this is the area of a face. So I'm going to use F to label facets now in one of these dials, because now we have objects that are cells, and we think the cells do something to control their behavior. Okay, and so one of the things that cells do to control their behavior is they don't open up their ion channels for lots of cell types. Okay, and so if you have a cell that doesn't open up its ion channels, then it's approximately incompressible. Approximately, if they don't open up their ion channels. And for the cell types we study, we assume that. Okay, so that means a V is a constant in 3D. Okay, then in the monolayer, we assume that there's a penalty to height fluctuations, because I showed you that there were those adherence junctions, there's a lot of structure there, that basically, you know, on the lateral interfaces, basically there's a height here, right? There's an H here, how high the thing is. And in a monolayer, you could imagine that those adherence junctions penalize you for perturbations where one cell is a lot higher than the other. So we're going to assume that there's a quadratic penalty, because that's the first order thing that can happen, right? In the monolayer, assume that there's a quadratic penalty for height fluctuations. Okay, so then you sort of say something like, okay, there's some energy penalty that goes like some number times H minus H naught, something like this. Okay, but of course the volume is the area times H, and if the fluctuations are small, quadratic penalty in height fluctuations leads to a quadratic penalty in area fluctuations. That is this, and it's the first order term. Okay, that's the idea of where that comes from. The second thing is this thing, which says that I have a basically interfacial tension that lives at each edge and that can be different on each edge. And in general, folks think about this as being generated by a competition between what people call cortical tension and adhesion. Okay. Okay, so cortical tension is real lovely. It's easy to measure. You stick a cell in a micropipette. If it has a surface tension-like behavior of the cortex, you make sure because there's this layer of dense actin and myosin right at the edge of these animal cells, and you suck it into a pipette, and maybe you know that if I have basically a surface tension-like term, once I get a hemisphere in my micropipette, there's an instability and I can suck it in further. So right away, you know if that instability occurs, it's a surface tension-like term. And then if you could control the pressure, basically you can use Laplace's law to figure out what the surface tension is, right? And so you could say, oh, I can measure the cortical tension of a non-adhering cell in this way. Evan Evans did it. There's a lot of experiments after that. Okay. Then there's this weird thing that's much harder to measure, that two cells, when they come together, they no longer look like a pair of spheres. So of course, if I just had a cortical tension and that was it, and I put two bubbles together and they had a cortical tension, they would stay round. But when you put two cells of these cell types together, they go, zoop, okay? And they look like a doublet. That's called a cell doublet. And that tells you right there that something weird is going on. There's like an adhesive energy or something that basically reduces the energy of this interface that makes this be the equilibrium shape of those two cells. Otherwise, I wouldn't get it. And you know, it has to be a strong enough in magnitude effect in order to balance and change the cell shapes, right? Okay, so people call that adhesion. I'm going to tell you that you can do a computation of like the typical number of E-cadherin molecules on the surface of these cells in AFM experiments of how much energy you get per cadherin bond, and it is completely unable to explain why things look like doublets, because it's like orders of magnitude too low in energy. So really what people have found is that there's this really complex feedback between adhesion and cortical actin in these cell types that depends on a whole bunch of other things like beta-catenin and lots of other things. It's complicated. But what I will say is that we try to incorporate whatever that balance is, including the signaling that the E-cadherins are doing, not just their net energy. And that's key, because like if you talk to biologists, they're like, oh, it's like literally the E-cadherins are sticking the cells together. That's not how it works. It really probably has to be downstream signaling. But nevertheless, you can say, oh, that net behavior is basically, and you can see it's actually kind of like, it's like an instability. Like when you first put the two together, the thing zips up, right? Okay. So this is what we're trying to incorporate. It's sort of the balance between those two effects generates a characteristic interfacial tension effectively at the interface between cells. Okay, and the last thing that I want to sort of talk about is this term. And this term, I should tell you, is pretty controversial. Fun. Okay, so when Farhadi-Farr and collaborators wrote the paper, they said that this was this p-squared term. It says that a cell has like a ring of actin and myosin that's actively wanting to contract, like a ratchet, and they modeled it with a p-squared term. So they called this a contractile ring. Okay. And so then you could wonder, if I don't have a cell type that has that contractile ring, maybe I don't have a p-squared term, right? But I would sort of say, actually, it could also be any other process that eventually limits the perimeter of a cell. So it's to a physicist, this is a second order term in the perimeter. And what it says is basically, if I have any process that's going to limit, like, let's say I start to like want to expand interfaces between two cells, but let's say I run out of coherence to stick at that interface. Well, then there's going to be a second order term on the scale of the cell that once I run out of those adhering molecules, I no longer get that adhesion anymore. So there's any process by which I'm going to limit the perimeter growth of a cell, that it can't keep expanding forever, is going to add a second order term. And so I would say actually there's a large class of things that actually give rise to a second order term. And not having a second order term, I would argue, is weird. And I'm telling you all of this because there's some uncertainty about whether you should have a second order term or not. I'm a firm believer in it because I'm a physicist, and otherwise you have instabilities. And so I like it to prevent instabilities. And also because I think biology likes to prevent instabilities. In fact, there's this really cool paper, Latour by, this is from Xavi Trepat, and I'm forgetting all of the other collaborators on it. I'm sorry, other collaborators. Where it's super elasticity in cells, and they basically have a term like this where they have a second order term, but they say actually the second order term depends on the area, and so you can actually change the effect of this by changing the area. And so this kind of term shows up a lot, and there's a lot of fun biology in it, and I think it should be studied more. Yeah, Lee. It can either be negative or positive. That's a great question. So in some cell types, you assume the linear term is negative and positive, and we'll actually be talking about what the rigidity behavior is as a function of that parameter. If it's negative. If it's positive, it's fine. Exactly. Right? Yeah. Well, it can't. Yeah, so well, I think the question, but I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that it depends on how you want to think about it. But if you basically have a sort of system in which when two cells come together, they really want to expand the interface significantly, that's negative. You can think about it as effectively being negative. Yeah, exactly. Let's talk about it tomorrow, because actually it will be the first thing I want to talk about tomorrow is what does that parameter mean, whether it's positive or negative. So no, actually you can, because the area term in the geometry gives rise to something else. So actually there's a geometric incompatibility potentially between a term that's okay, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay. What other questions do folks have? We're way past time already. So I'll stop here and I'll take any additional questions. Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what we mean here, because if you think about like, I don't know, Landau and Lifshitz, if you want a p-squared term, you really need something that's not behaving like an active gel. You need something that's actively contractile. And so some cell types clearly have it. Like there's some cell types that just go zoop, right? Like if they, sometimes if they can. Other cell types that are confluent monolayers, it's not so clear they have an actively contracting ring, I will say. At least I don't think it's obvious. Yeah, and so what I will say is the reason that you may think that could be a useful formulation for two reasons. One, let's say you think this is actually not that sometimes the assumption that there's an active gel on each interface is wrong, a la Shiladicha and Margaret, and that actually it's a spring with it behaves more like a spring with a rest length, then you would definitely want to separate out that term and give it a slightly different functional. Another thing that you may want to do is if I have two cell types, then I clearly have heterotypic interactions between two cell types. And then I really also want that term broken out again because I could differentiate cells between homotypic neighbors and heterotypic neighbors. And I might think that there's different properties at the heterotypic interface. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, I'm just going to complete the square tomorrow and say they're both the same thing. And so, yeah. Do we have time to take one more question? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm hoping that I will get to that tomorrow. But let me just say, like in one sentence, if you basically have an order parameter, which is the connectivity that you can measure, and like, I'm pointing at Edward in the back because I showed you that beautiful paper of his with the sort of network of cells connecting to one another. And basically, if you look at Z, the connectivity of the cells, and that really tells you when the rigidity happens is when you drop below the isostatic point. That is definitely a signature of a first order rigidity transition. Absolutely. If you, on the other hand, you have systems where you know you're under constrained and you still go through rigidity transitions all the time, it's pretty good bet it's second order. And there's a lot more to say, but that's just a hand wavy first pass. Yeah. Do we need any announcements before we go for today? Okay, we're done.